The hunter discovered a dog chained to a tree, and as he approached, he couldn't contain his emotions, bursting into uncontrollable tears. Carlos had always cherished his walks through the forest. He found peace in the sound of birds chirping and the scent of trees. However, on that particular day, something unusual occurred. As he strolled along an unfamiliar path, he heard a faint sound, almost like a cry. He paused, glanced around, and carefully followed the noise. He stumbled upon a sight that left him breathless. A malnourished dog with dirty and matted fur was tied to a tree with a tight leash. It appeared so exhausted and frail that it could barely move. Beside it, 5 tiny puppies, huddled close, seeking protection and warmth. Their eyes were filled with sadness, as if pleading for help. Despite having witnessed many things during his hikes, Carlos had never encountered anything like this before. His heart ached at the sight of these suffering animals. He knew he couldn't simply walk away. Something deep inside urged him to intervene. Slowly, he crouched down to avoid frightening the dog and began contemplating how to rescue this little family. As Carlos drew nearer to the dog, he noticed the extent of its suffering. The strap around its neck was so tight that it had injured the skin, leaving ugly scars that must have caused immense pain. The poor creature was so weak that it could barely lift its head to look at him. It seemed utterly drained, as if it had been struggling for a long time without strength. The puppies were no better off. They were so small and thin, shivering from cold and hunger. They tried to hide under their mother's belly, seeking warmth and security. But the mother, so tired and wounded, could barely care for them. It was a heartbreaking scene to witness. Carlos felt overwhelming sadness at the situation. He realized that the animals had likely been living for days, perhaps weeks, without sufficient food or water. It was as if everyone else around them was at peace, while they remained trapped in their suffering. He understood that he needed to act swiftly because they wouldn't survive much longer. Carlos knew he had to be extremely cautious in helping the dog. He didn't want to scare her further, as she was already frightened and weak. So he approached very slowly, speaking in a low voice, as if trying to reassure her. He had some food in his backpack, dried meat that he always carried on his walks. He took out a piece and offered it to the dog, attempting to gain her trust. Initially, the dog hesitated. She looked at Carlos with suspicion, unsure whether he posed a threat or genuinely intended to help. But, after a few seconds, the smell of food caught her attention. She sniffed the air and with great difficulty stretched her neck to take the piece that Carlos was offering. Carefully, she took the food and ate it quickly, as if she hadn't eaten in a long time. Gradually, her confidence began to grow. Carlos continued to speak to her calmly, getting closer and closer until he was finally near enough to assist. He took out his knife and with great care cut the strap that was tightly wrapped around her neck. The dog, now free, let out a deep sigh, as if she could finally breathe without pain. Carlos smiled, knowing that the first step to saving that family had been accomplished. Before continuing, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you love animals and their moving stories. Once Carlos managed to free the dog, he felt that he needed to act quickly. Every second seemed crucial. Although still weak, the dog was finally free from the leash that had hurt her. She collapsed onto the ground, exhausted, as if she could finally rest. But Carlos knew that this wasn't the end of her problems. Approaching gently, he saw the wounds on her neck. The marks from the leash were deep, and some were infected, causing pain that she seemed to endure silently. Carlos took out his water bottle and an old cloth he had in his backpack. Carefully, he moistened the cloth and began cleaning the wounds. With each touch, he tried to be as gentle as possible, fearing to cause her more pain. The dog barely moved, as if she understood that he was there to help her. What broke Carlos's heart was the way she looked at him, with eyes full of pain and exhaustion, but also growing trust, as if she knew that this stranger was her only chance to survive. He spoke in a low voice, using simple and calm words, as if trying to console her with his voice. "Is everything okay now? I'm here to help you." After tending to the mother, Carlos turned his attention to the puppies. They were so small, they barely had the strength to move. One of them was trembling so violently that Carlos immediately removed his jacket and used it to cover them, attempting to provide some warmth. He improvised a shelter using his backpack as a small nest to protect them from the cold. Seeing them so vulnerable, something inside him broke. Those puppies would never have a chance to survive without help. Carlos drank a little water and offered it to the puppies on the lid of a bottle. Little by little, with slow and fragile movements, the little ones began to drink, fighting to stay alive. The dog, though exhausted, watched everything closely, as if thanking Carlos for every gesture. Carlos paused for a moment and looked into the dog's eyes. There was something profound in that gaze, something he couldn't articulate with words. It was as if, for a brief second, he could feel all the pain she was carrying. The suffering she had endured wasn't merely physical. It was the result of cruelty that Carlos couldn't comprehend. That animal, so fragile and defenseless, had been treated with malice that made no sense to him. How could someone do this? He whispered to himself, his voice drowned by the impact and sadness. Carlos had always been a strong man. His life as a hunter had hardened him against the difficulties of nature. He wasn't the type to be easily moved, rarely shedding a tear even in the toughest situations. But at that moment, seeing that dog suffer alongside her defenseless puppies, something within him shattered. Without realizing it, tears began to roll silently down his face. They weren't tears of weakness, but of deep empathy, a connection with the pain that the mother was experiencing. He couldn't help it. No matter how hard he tried to remain strong, the weight of that scene was overwhelming. He quickly wiped his eyes, as if wanting to conceal the emotion he felt. But he couldn't deny the sadness that engulfed him. The cruelty that the animal had faced seemed so unfair, so cruel, and Carlos felt a knot in his chest. In that instant, he knew he would do whatever it took to change the fate of that family. After providing the initial care to the dog and her puppies, Carlos prepared to take them away from there. He had wrapped the puppies carefully in his jacket, creating a small improvised bed so they wouldn't feel colder. It was then that, while tidying up the area around the tree, something shiny caught his eye among the dry and dirty leaves. The light reflecting off the object immediately drew his attention. He slowly crouched, moving the leaves and branches with his hands to uncover what it was. At first, it looked like just a piece of metal lying on the ground, perhaps a can or something similar. But when he cleaned off the dirt a bit, Carlos realized that there was something special about that object. The shape was different, and the metal, though worn, displayed intricate engravings on its surface. It was a shield of arms, the symbol carved into the strange era, with details that Carlos didn't immediately recognize. But there was something that made it seem important, maybe even ancient. He lifted the shield, cleaning it better with the fabric of his shirt, and examined it closely. The weight of the object, the delicate work on the engraving set, wasn't just a random piece of metal thrown away. As he ran his fingers over the shield, he felt a strange sensation, as if that find might have some connection to the history of the dog. What is this doing here, he thought, trying to understand. Despite his focus on rescuing the animals, Carlos couldn't help but think that the shield could be a significant clue. Who had abandoned the dog there? And why? Perhaps the owner of the object knew something about it. Carlos, who had always been practical and direct, now found himself wrapped in unexpected curiosity. Something about that piece intrigued him deeply. He kept the shield in the pocket of his pants, determined to investigate later what it meant. There was still much to do. The priority was to take the dog and her puppies to a safe place. But the mystery of the shield lingered in his mind. The weight of that small metal object seemed to carry more than just material significance. It was as if he were carrying a story with him. Perhaps the key to understanding why those animals had been abandoned, alone and suffering. While preparing to leave, Carlos looked at the dog one more time, which now, although weak, seemed to have a bit more tranquility in her eyes. He knew he had done the right thing by helping her, but he also knew that there was something more behind that situation, something he couldn't yet decipher. That shield would be an important piece of a larger puzzle, and Carlos was determined to uncover all the answers, no matter how long it took. After caring for the dog and her puppies as best he could in the forest, Carlos knew it was time to take them to a safer location. He stood up and approached the car, calling the dog with the same calmness as before, waiting for her to follow him. But, to his surprise, the dog stopped. She looked at the vehicle with distrust, her ears drooping and her body tense, as if something was holding her back. She didn't move forward, despite appearing to trust Carlos. Every time he called her, the dog took a step backward. Her eyes, previously filled with pain, now reflected pure fear. Carlos realized that she wasn't only scared by the current situation. That behavior stemmed from something deeper. Perhaps her past, which she didn't know, was filled with traumas she couldn't overcome. The way she looked at the car suggested that she associated vehicles with something terrible. Perhaps the moment she was abandoned, or even mistreated. Carlos knelt on the ground, trying not to appear threatening. He extended his hand with a piece of food, as he had done before, and spoke softly. "Girl, you're safe now. I won't hurt you," he said with a soft and patient voice. He knew it was a battle against her memories, not against him. It was as if the trauma of what she had experienced prevented her from fully trusting any human, even someone who was clearly there to help her. The dog hesitated. She sniffed the air, still undecided. The fear was still strong, but there was something in the tone of Carlos's voice that seemed to calm her. She started taking small steps toward him, though her body remained tense. Carlos knew he couldn't rush her. Forcing the situation would only scare her more. So he stayed there, on his knees, waiting patiently. He offered another piece of food, and after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the dog approached and took the food from his hand. With a gentle expression, Carlos slowly led her to the car. When they reached the open door, he noticed she was still hesitant, with her tail down and her eyes wide open. But now, having gained a little more of her trust, he carefully picked up one of the puppies and placed it inside the car. The dog watched the puppy, and although filled with fear, she seemed to understand that it should be by her side. Still nervous, she finally got into the car, keeping her eyes on the puppies, as if ensuring they were safe. Carlos closed the door slowly, relieved to have succeeded. The dog's fear was still present, strong, like a shadow of the past that couldn't be erased. But now, at least, he knew he was beginning to break the barrier that trauma had created. After a silent drive to the city, Carlos took them to the nearest veterinary clinic. The dog and her puppies were tired, but he knew they still needed urgent attention. As soon as he entered the clinic, he was greeted by an experienced veterinarian who quickly recognized the seriousness of the situation. The dog was carefully placed on an examination table, and Carlos stood by, watching every movement anxiously. The veterinarian began examining the dog, checking the wounds on her neck, signs of malnutrition, and her overall health condition. He looked at Carlos with a serious expression. "She has been through a lot," the veterinarian said. "The wounds on her neck are deep, but we will take care of them. She is very weak, but with proper treatment, she has a good chance of recovery." Carlos felt relieved upon hearing those words. He knew the recovery would be long, but at least now there was hope. While the veterinarian applied the first medications to disinfect the wounds and alleviate the dog's pain, Carlos observed the puppies, who were still restless and agitated. However, the smallest of them caught the veterinarian's attention. When examining one of the puppies more closely, he frowned. "This one here has a deformity in the skull," lifting the little animal to show it to Carlos. "It is probably the result of some aggression suffered by the mother while she was pregnant. She may have difficulties developing." Carlos felt a knot in his chest upon hearing that. The little one was smaller and frailer than the others, and now he knew that her survival would be even more challenging. But instead of becoming discouraged, Carlos was resolute. He looked at the little animal in the veterinarian's arms and knew that he would do everything he could to give them all the opportunity for a better life, including that special puppy. The veterinarian continued with the exams, administering the first aid, cleaning the puppies, and applying medicines to ensure that everyone had a chance to recover. "They will need a lot of care and time to recover completely," Carlos said. "But with patience, they will improve." While the veterinarian finished caring for the animals, Carlos remained silent, reflecting on everything that had happened since the moment he found that little family in the forest. After ensuring that the dog and her puppies received the necessary care at the veterinary clinic, Carlos couldn't shake off the injustice that these animals had endured. The dog's painful gaze and the fragile state of the puppies continued to haunt his mind. He knew that he couldn't simply accept what had happened and continue with his life as if nothing had occurred. He needed to understand who had been so cruel as to abandon them in that situation. Then he remembered the shield he had found near the tree where the dog was tied. He took the object out of his pocket and studied it again, feeling that it could be an important clue. The symbol on the metal was still a mystery, but Carlos was determined to discover what it meant. He began investigating, asking the local neighbors. He went door to door, describing what he had found and showing the shield. Some people looked at him curiously, others indifferently. But one thing was certain: nobody seemed to immediately recognize who could be responsible. However, Carlos didn't give up. He knew that, in small towns, news and rumors spread quickly, and someone would know something. After days of investigation and talking to the residents, he finally found a clue. An older man, known for knowing the old stories of the region. "That shield belongs to an old family here," he said, pointing to the object. "They have a large farm nearby. Rumor has it that they are going through difficulties." Carlos felt his heart racing. The pieces began to fit together. The mentioned farm was in a remote area, and if they were facing financial troubles, that could explain the abandonment of the animals, although it wouldn't justify the cruelty. Carlos decided he would go there. He needed to confront the responsible party and find out the truth behind that abandonment. He got into his truck and drove to the farm. As he approached, the scenery began to change. The land was neglected. The broken fences in the main house seemed aged by time and abandonment. Carlos parked the car and got out, feeling a mix of nervousness and anger. If someone on that farm had caused so much suffering to those animals, he wanted answers. He walked to the entrance of the property, where he was greeted by a young man with a tired and distressed look. Carlos didn't waste time and showed him the shield, asking directly if he knew anything about the abandonment of the dogs. The man hesitated for a moment, looking away, but Carlos knew that there was something behind that silence. "I just want to understand what happened," Carlos said, trying to remain calm though anger was rising. "Those animals were left to die." "You can't ignore that." The man sighed deeply, as if the weight of his actions was crushing him. "We couldn't take care of everything anymore," he admitted in a low voice. "Things got difficult here, and we didn't know what to do with the dogs." What that man faced, he didn't realize, was that Carlos was also dealing with his own financial difficulties, perhaps worse than imagined. In fact, at that precise moment, Carlos was going through one of the most complicated stages of his life. His brother had a serious health condition, and the medications he needed were extremely expensive. So expensive that, many times, Carlos was at a crossroads. He had to choose between buying food or paying for the medications. No seal of approval. The weight of that responsibility crushed him every day. Because of this, Carlos had started hunting every day. Any meat he could get in the forest was a small relief, because that meant the money he would spend on food could be used for other needs. Though exhausted, he continued firmly, forcing himself to believe that he would overcome the situation. But inside him, he struggled with thoughts he didn't even dare to say aloud. Before finding that dog tied up in the forest, a terrible idea had already begun to creep into his mind, something that filled him with guilt every time it arose. "And if I donate my dogs, or even sell them," he thought silently, his heart oppressed. Carlos had his own dogs, and they were his family. Just thinking about the possibility of getting rid of them sent a cold shiver through his body. No, he couldn't bear the idea. Simply considering it made him feel disgusted with himself. As a human being, he despised himself for even entertaining such a possibility. "No," he said to himself firmly, as if trying to expel that dark idea from his mind. "We will overcome this together." And it was at that moment, just after reaffirming his determination, that he found that dog abandoned in the forest. Now, standing in front of that man, listening to his story, Carlos felt something deep. He was face to face with someone who had gone through a situation similar to his, someone who faced the same difficulties and, however, had made a decision that Carlos never had the courage to take. When he looked into the eyes of that man, who now had a heavy look of regret and guilt, Carlos felt a kind of relief. He realized that his choice to keep his dogs, even in the face of difficulties, was one of the best decisions he had made. The pain of regret and guilt that man would carry for the rest of his life was too heavy a burden to bear. Carlos understood at that moment that the price of getting rid of his animals would be much higher than he imagined, and it wasn't a financial price. It was the weight on the soul, the type of burden that, once assumed, never lets go. Carlos remained silent for a moment, processing everything that had just transpired in his mind. He looked at the man in front of him, seeing not only someone who had made an impulsive decision, but a person broken by the weight of that choice. Repentance was etched in his eyes, and Carlos knew that feeling wouldn't disappear soon. The man had let himself be carried away by despair, doing something that, in normal circumstances, he might never have done. Carlos breathed deeply, remembering all the times he thought about making the same decision. He knew, viscerally, what poverty and difficulties could do to a person's mind. He knew what it was like to fight for survival, what it was like to be consumed by the fear of not having enough, and how, in those moments, dark ideas could arise, tempting. But now, seeing the state of that man, Carlos felt a silent confirmation in his heart. He had made the right decision. His own dogs, those faithful companions, had always been by his side, even in the most difficult days. They asked for nothing more than love and care. And in some way, that was what gave Carlos the strength to move forward. They were part of his family, and getting rid of them would have been like betraying something sacred. When he saw that man, Carlos understood that he would never have been able to carry the weight of such a painful decision. He looked directly into the eyes of the man and, for a brief moment, felt empathy. It wasn't only anger that filled his heart now, but a deep understanding. He knew how much difficulties could push a person to feel desperate, leading her to make decisions that, in another context, would be unthinkable. "I understand," Carlos said, with a softer voice than expected. "I know you were in a difficult moment. I also thought of doing something similar, but I realized that I couldn't live with that decision. I know that now you will have to carry that weight, and it is very heavy." The man looked at Carlos with eyes full of regret, unable to say anything. The pain of the error was already there, consuming him little by little. Carlos sighed, feeling that the tension in his shoulders was relaxing a bit. He wasn't there to judge, but he couldn't ignore what had happened. He knew that justice for those dogs wasn't only about saving their lives, but also ensuring that something like that wouldn't happen again. "I hope you learn from this," Carlos continued, now with a firm tone, "because this kind of pain doesn't disappear, and you will have to live with it." The man remained silent, without words. Carlos knew that there wasn't much more to say. The regret of that man was evident, and the lesson had already been learned in the most difficult way possible. Carlos felt a mixture of emotions. He had faced his own shadows throughout this journey, and now he understood the true value of the decisions he had made. The dogs he had almost considered abandoning were waiting at home, just like the dog and her puppies he had rescued. They weren't just animals. They were his companions, his family. And he knew, more than ever, that he could never betray them. As he started the car, Carlos looked at the ranch in ruins for the last time. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he had left something important behind in that place. The decision to never allow difficulties to lead him to betray those who truly cared. He, his dogs, and the new furry family that was now part of his life would face the future together, with their heads held high. And that was, without a doubt, the best decision he had made. Thank you very much for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your opinion about this story.